So this session is on labor markets and the economics of non-pharmaceutical interventions. The first paper is measuring the labor market at the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, and the presenting author is Jesse Rothstein.
Hi. Can you all hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Great, great, thank you. So thanks a lot for having me. This is joint work with Alex Bardick and Marianne Bertrand and Feng Lin and Matt Unrath. And I want to mention that we're relying a lot on data from Homebase, which we're very grateful for, and we'll talk a lot more about that as we go. Oh, let's see if I can get this to move. Okay, there we go. So we're really after what we think of as two big goals. One is just trying to understand and document the nature of the labor market decline at the beginning, which sectors, when it is, which workers, the role of firms, and we're going to focus a lot on small businesses because that's what's covered by the data we have. And then second, to kind of provide some at least preliminary evidence on the effects of the shutdown orders and other economic interventions at the onset of the crisis. So the first finding is just that this is a really different recession from other recessions. I think others have seen this as well. We just have some ways of trying to illustrate it. So this just shows job losses by sector from the CES payroll survey for the Great Recession and this one. And you can see that in 2 months, we lost 60% more jobs than we did in the entirety of the Great Recession. A much sharper decline and very differently distributed. Where you think of a traditional recession as driven by male-dominated sectors, construction, manufacturing, this was very dominated by female-dominated sectors, in particular leisure and hospitality. And that makes it a very different type of cycle. Another thing that makes it different is there are extremely high rates of temporary layoff and very high rates of recall expectations. Most of the workers who lost their jobs expected that they would be going back, which is not something that we've seen at all ever in the past, and certainly not in recent recessions. We're going to be relying a lot on data from a firm, Homebase, which provides scheduling and time clock services to small businesses. We'll be relying on the time clock. So when hourly workers at small businesses go in and start work, they punch in and then they punch out, and this collects the data. That allows us to have daily data on the number of hours worked by worker and firm for the Homebase clients. Now, Homebase is not representative. It's very much disproportionately very small firms. So over half of the firms have less than 5 full-time equivalent employees. So it's very small firms, very concentrated in food and drink and retail. So you want to think of this as restaurants and shops are using this. That's fortunate in that those are sectors that were really particularly hard hit by this crisis, and so we can really zero in on them. But there's no sense in which this is representative, and we need to be clear about that. We can use these data to just see hours of work by day since the beginning of this crisis. And we normalize everything relative to the end of January. And we can see that basically the entire collapse happened in 2 weeks. On March 12th, hours worked were 96% of their late January average. 2 weeks later, it was 44%. So that was almost all of the collapse. The nadir actually almost perfectly lined up with the CPS reference week in April. And then we've had gradual recovery since then. So now we're back up about halfway to where we were before the crisis in terms of the number of hours at home-based firms. Second result is that these firm shutdowns and reopenings have played a large role, at least in the home-based data. So we can see that about half of the home-based firms shut down for at least a week, which we define as nobody reported any hours at that firm in the week. Those shutdowns account for about half of the lost hours, with almost all of the rest of the half coming from individual workers who didn't work in a week, not so much from workers whose shifts were cut. About 60% of the firms that have closed have since reopened, meaning they had a week without hours, and now they've had at least 1 week with positive hours. And they're averaging about 2/3 of the scale they had before the shutdown. So they've reopened, but at a smaller scale. When they've reopened, it's almost always come by rehiring workers who worked at the firm before. There are very few workers who are new. The share of new workers is growing over time as we get further and further from the crisis. But that's maybe not so surprising because these are firms that have pretty high turnover in any case. It would be surprising if a huge share of the workers at these firms were the same as the workers in March, even without the recession. If you look at which firms exit, the small firms are much more likely to exit than larger firms. And interestingly, there is this harvesting that the firms that were already unhealthy, the firms that had shrinking employment in the year leading up to the crisis, they're much more likely to exit than firms that that have been growing or stable. The firm size for reopening doesn't seem that much different. The small firms were more likely to close, but the small and large firms that closed are about equally likely to reopen. By growth rate, the firms that were already shrinking are much less likely to reopen. So it does look like this drove some firms out. The next set of analyses we do is who are the workers who lose their jobs. When we're looking within industry and within state in doing this. And we generally see is a pattern you might expect, which is the more disadvantaged workers are the ones who are more likely to be laid off, and they're the ones who are less likely to be rehired. So we can look across age. You see that the youngest workers and the oldest workers are much more likely to be laid off. These plots are showing marginal effects in percentage points from a regression that's controlling for the other characteristics and from industry and for industry and state. So the workers under 25 are about 8 percentage points more likely to be laid off than workers in their 20s and 30s. Workers over 65 are 14 percentage points more likely. The older workers are less likely to be called back when the firm reopens. So it does look like some of these workers have exited for, maybe not for good, but for a while. That's not as true for the younger workers. There's a big education gradient in layoff. The least educated workers are the most likely to be laid off even within these firms and within these industries. There's not as much of an education gradient in rehiring. And then there are big racial gaps. In particular, Black workers are much more likely to be laid off and much less likely to be recalled. We see something similar with Asian workers, although obviously the samples are smaller there. This is what we see this is current population survey data. So this is not based on the small firms and home base, but based on everybody who was working in March and not in April, or everybody who was not working in April but was in May. But we get pretty similar results if we look within the home base data and look at workers who are laid off. One thing we can do in the home base data is we can match it to a survey that we did of home base workers. So we can get information that goes beyond what you have in typical administrative data. So we collected a bunch of demographics in the survey. We also collected some worker expectations. And what we can see in this is that if you look at the people who stopped work and were not working at the time of the survey, and you ask them, do you expect you'll be rehired? The ones who do expect to be rehired are much more likely to go back to work in the subsequent weeks than the ones who didn't expect that. So whether we phrase it as, do you expect you'll be rehired, or did your employer say they would rehire you? Those are very strongly predictive of whether you actually wind up going back. Now that's, I think, helpful because we do know that the large shares of workers who lost their jobs during this downturn said that they expected to be recalled. And so to the extent that that's informed, that these results generalize, that says that these are pretty highly likely to be recalled workers. On the other hand, as we move on from the trough, more and more of the workers who are there are the ones who didn't say they expected to be recalled. So I think that we're going to have smaller, harder times getting people back as we go forward. Fourth finding, if you look at the shutdown and reopening orders and try to use variation across states and when they implemented an order or when they lifted it, you can then look and see whether hours recovered right after the reopening or whether they went away right after the shutdown, and compare those to other states where the orders were at different times. We're going to find that the orders do have an effect, but it's small relative to the broader time pattern. And so I'll show that here. These are event study models where we allow for state-specific trends and we allow for common time shocks across all states. And we do two separate models, one for shutdown orders and one for reopening orders. If you look at the shutdown orders, which are the red line, we see that in a couple days after a shutdown order goes into effect, we see about a 10 percentage point drop in number of hours worked. It does look like these orders do have some effect. This is matched by pretty similar declines in the number of people who are traveling to businesses, if you look at other data based on location patterns. So my interpretation is that this is in large part reflecting declines in demand when these orders take effect, but we're not entirely sure. And then when you look at the reopening orders, they're not quite as sudden, but they have a comparable magnitude, about a 10 percentage point increase in hours worked in the 10 days or so after the order is lifted. But you can compare those 10 percentage point effects to the calendar time effects. There's just the pure effect of it being April 1st relative to early March. And you see that those are effects that are common across all states. And we see that those are 70%, 60% declines in hours worked. So it does look like what happened is there was this really sharp decline in hours worked in late March that was common across all states, whether or not they implemented shutdown orders. And then the shutdown orders added a little bit more to that, but not very much. Most of it seems to be driven by the pure calendar time effects. And again, that's mirrored by other measures that seem like they're proxies for demand. Most of the hours drop seems to be that the customers went away, not that the government said you can't go to work. And then the last set of analyses that we've done is trying to compare states that we're trying to look at the effects of policies. The PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, this was the loans to small businesses. There's no state policy variation in this. It's a national program, but it was pretty haphazard in the way the loans went out. And some states, it seems like they got more loans than others. And it looks like it was driven by some banks were better prepared to process these loans quickly. The first wave of PPP ran out very quickly. And so if your bank wasn't ready to process loans on day one, you might not have had a chance at those loans. We can look across states by what quartile they're in, by the amount of loans they got per payroll. Fourth quartile is the highest disbursement states. We've also divided states by the replacement rate from the Ganong and Noel and Vavra paper, by the unemployment insurance replacement rate. So the fourth quartile are the states that had the most generous unemployment benefits. And what we can see is that the most generous states by unemployment insurance, also the highest PPP volume states, are all states, they had smaller declines in hours worked, and if anything, larger recoveries, faster recoveries afterward. Now, you might have thought that the unemployment rates, a lot of the concern has been that the very generous replacement rates are discouraging workers from going back to work. But what we see is the states that have the most generous replacement rates are having the fastest return to work. Now, this is not a quasi-experimental analysis. This is just a cross-state regression. And a lot of it goes away or at least shrinks and becomes insignificant when we put in state census division fixed effects. So I don't want to say that this is causal, but there's at least very weak evidence that these policies, that the unemployment rate retarded recovery. It looks, if anything, the evidence looks like it goes the other way. The same issue with the PPP loans. The states that got more PPP loans were states that were already having larger declines in employment when the PPP program was passed. So it can't be that it's entirely the causal effect of the PPP loan program. But it does look like there's at least some evidence that it kind of is associated with faster recoveries. So that's the basic results. The kind of conclusions, this is a very different recession. And we want to be very careful, I think, about generalizing anything we know from other recessions to what's going on here. It was extremely fast. The recovery was extremely fast. We kind of got lucky that the CPS happened to be timed to the nadir of the recession. If this had happened 2 weeks off, we might have missed a large share of the decline in the official statistics. It's led by very different sectors than the ones that we usually think of. It's all in-person services employment have been really the drivers of it. And the unemployed workers overwhelmingly expect to be recalled, which is very different. And many of them have been recalled. We're definitely seeing kind of gradients that the more disadvantaged workers have been the most likely to be laid off and the least likely to be rehired so far. I think I'm concerned that will persist, but we obviously don't know what will happen in the future. In the short runs, we find effects of both shelter-in-place orders and then the lifting of those orders on hours worked, but they're small relative to the time pattern, which we think is mostly just the customers disappeared, not that the workers couldn't go to work. I think there's some indication that the PPP loans sheltered the blow, and no evidence that the unemployment insurance replacement rates slowed recovery. But we don't have strong identification of those effects, but at least the first order patterns don't point to that. So I will stop there. I think I'm a little bit early.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jesse. The later open discussion thanks you for the extra time. The next paper, we're going to pair these two papers before we go to the discussants, is tracking public and private responses to the COVID-19 epidemic, evidence from state and local government actions, and the presenting author is Sumita Gupta.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen now.
Great.
Sorry about that. All right. Thank you for the opportunity to present this work. Today I'm talking about mandated and voluntary social distancing during the COVID-19. I'm Sumedha Gupta. I'm assistant professor at the Department of Economics at IUPUI. And this is joint work with Kosali Simon and Cody Wing, both at Indiana University. The primary response to the COVID-19, the primary non-pharmaceutical intervention to mitigate the transmission of the virus has been social distancing. And our work finds that a large amount of social distancing has occurred, but we also find that a lot of that happened prior to the state's mandated stay-at-home orders. And it, in fact, also occurred in states that never implemented stay-at-home orders, which seems to suggest that the substantial decline in mobility was at least in part due to private response to new information about the risk of information than policy induced. So it seems that these findings highlight that individual behavior can play an important role in the dynamics of the disease evolution. And of course, there is a big body of literature starting from Kermack and McKendrick, based in the SIR models that traces the dynamics of the disease. But there is a smaller body of econ epitype models which nest individual behaviors within the SIR models and find that individual behavioral choices these adaptive responses may reduce the infection transmission, which the SIR models traditionally do not take into account. And there is, of course, a much larger body of literature which looks at the production of health as an investment as well as consumption. And in this work, we sketch out a very simple micro model of the individual behavior of social distancing, not of transmission, but of the behavior of social distancing. So in this model, an individual maximizes the utility, which is based on three commodities. There is the regular kind of commodities, like you go to a restaurant, you enjoy a meal, and then there is occupation, which generates income, and then there is the health status of the individual. And each of these commodities which go into the individual's utility function are produced with market goods, with the time which is devoted to the production of those those commodities, and the amount of physical contact involved in that commodity production. The health production function also has inputs of market goods that go into it, the time which is spent in producing health, and then also the physical or the social interaction with people. But in this case, it enters with this parameter rho, which is an exogenous parameter and captures sort of infectious disease risk environment. So if in a normal environment, when there is no epidemic going on, this rho is normalized to 1. But in the case of COVID-19 now, where the risk of transmission is high, individuals, when they maximize the utility, the derived demand for the social interaction might be lower in this case. And of course, then we have, of course, the optimization is done with respect to the budget constraint and the time constraint. With this model, so while this model helps us motivate the fact that individual behavior can lead to lower social interaction, what it does not take into account is that there are externalities here. Lower social interaction, individuals are not taking into account that lower social interaction has a positive externality on other people. And as a result, there is market failure, and there is role for government policy. And there are several policy instruments which might be possible. There are more nuanced ones where you could have targeted ones where you tax certain kinds of social interaction. but those may not be feasible in the short run. In the short run, when an epidemic hits, then most likely governments are, the options they have is like emergency declarations and shutdowns. In the case of COVID-19, the state and local governments have taken those initiatives of implementing social distancing inducing policies. And the federal government, so far at least, has been mostly focused on the financial help part of it and the economy. So what kind of policies have we implemented? And we, of course, most of us have heard of stay-at-home orders, but actually there are about 15 to 20 different measures which were taken. And we have collected data on this from different sources, including releases from the governor's offices, data collected by University of Washington and Boston University researchers. And after we sift through all of these, there are about 7 to 8 prominent ones, which I plot on this graph. On the x-axis is the timeline starting from early January, when the first case, which is the purple line, when the first cases started to show up in the different states. And on the y-axis is the percentage of the US population that is residing in states that have been affected by those events or policies. And we find that very quickly, starting from the 20th of January, by the first week of March, all 50 US states had first confirmed case of COVID-19. And around the start of March, states started implementing emergency declarations. And soon after that, it was followed by school closures, gathering restrictions, restaurant business closures, and only towards the second half of March and the end of March, states implemented stay-at-home orders and non-essential business closures as well. So together, although these are a whole bunch of policies, we can think about them in our work. That's what we have done, is to think about them in 2 different ways. They bin them as informational events, which are like first confirmed case, first death, and emergency declaration. And they're informational and not restrictive directly. They do not mandate social distancing, but they are information which people might perceive as a sense of urgency that, okay, now the epidemic is at my front door and I need to socially distance. And then there are mandates which directly restrict social interaction, which is like school closures, restaurant business closures, gathering restrictions, and stay-at-home orders. The reopenings looked somewhat different. So on this plot, again, on the x-axis is the timeline. Each state is represented with its timeline, starting from the stay-at-home orders represented with the red scatter dots. The orange scatter dots represent the timing of their announcement of reopenings, and the blue scatter plots are the actual initial openings. You can see there's a whole lot of variation going on. There are states like South Carolina, which closed pretty much in the beginning of April, and 20 days later they reopened. There are 5 states which never had stay-at-home orders, but had official initial reopenings. And there are states which opened everything right away. There are states which opened things very gradually. So unlike stay-at-home orders, which are somewhat homogeneous across the states, reopenings are relatively heterogeneous in terms of what exactly they mean. So how much social distancing did actually occur? The usual data sets which are at our disposal do not have good measures or high frequency measures of social interaction. So we have used in our research data from cell signal aggregators, Apple Mobility, Google Mobility, PlaceIQ, and SafeGraph. And there are a whole bunch of measures. We have considered about 12 different measures. And why it's important to look at these different measures is that they capture somewhat different subpopulations. They have more or less representation in different geographic areas. They capture different types of app users. So it's really important to examine several of these measures to assess the robustness and the generality of these results. So what exactly did mobility look like during COVID-19? So here I present 2 plots. These are looking at the one on the left, which is labeled as the mixing index. It comes from PlaceIQ. Mixing index measures the number of smart devices in a specific geographic location. And we take that as a measure of a proxy of social interaction, and therefore it's important for transmission. On the x-axis is again the timeline. We look at the period from mid-February to about start of June. Each of these faint gray lines represent one of the 50 US states. The line turns red when the state implements stay-at-home orders. And then the line turns green when the state officially reopens. The solid black line is a smooth 7-day moving and national average of these. Right away, we can notice that there is this big drop in the mixing index around the mid of March and prior to the states implementing stay-at-home orders, which is the red part of these lines. And again, looking at the beginning of May, end of April, we again see that these mobility measures start tilting up before the lines turn green. So people started moving before the states officially reopened. We see a similar pattern if we look at another mobility measure, which is the fraction leaving home. This is the measure that comes from SafeGraph. And in this, we again notice the same pattern. Mobility drops before stay-at-home orders and starts increasing before initial openings. And not only this, I talked about 12 of these. You can keep going through the whole list of the mobility measures, the same pattern over and over again, over and over again. You can see that. These are two measures which measure the amount of time people have been spending at home. One is called the median hours at home. You find a significant jump up middle of March, and then the time at home starts going down before the policy initial reopening as well. So clearly, there has been private responses before the policy have been implemented. So how much of this response has been policy? We evaluated that using standard event study regressions, in which YST is the amount of mobility in state S at time t. And then we have all these dummy variables to event to time. And WST is a vector of state by day, temperature, and precipitation, because we don't have mobility data from previous years. So this is a way to adjust for seasonality. We have state and day fixed effects, and we have standard errors clustered at state level. So what is the effect of the policies on closure? Providing, here I plot two of the event studies. One is the effect of emergency declaration, which is an informational event more than direct mandates on social distancing, on the mixing index again. And the second one is the effect of stay-at-home orders on the mixing index. The gray vertical line represents the period before, the day before the implementation of these policies or events. And right away we see that following the emergency declaration, there is a significant decline in the mixing index. And after the stay-at-home orders also, there is an immediate significant decline, but this is much more short-lived. And these estimates are, of course, noisy because these are daily measures. But we do not find evidence of significant pre-trends in this. But these are, of course, I've talked about a whole bunch of policies, whole bunch of mobility measures. So in this table, I try to summarize that what about the effects of other policies and the other mobility measures? Overall, we find that for the informational events like first confirmed case, emergency declaration, and first death, within 5 days, so effects after 5 days, there's a 1 to 14% decline in mobility following the informational events. And after 20 days, we find from about 9 to 52% reduction in the as a result of the informational events. Comparing that to the mandates like school closures that stay at home, the gray shaded cells depict the event studies in which the pre-trends were significant, so the parallel trend assumption is violated. So we will not causally interpret those. But here also, for instance, looking at school closures, we find that there is a significant decline, but these are of much smaller magnitude as compared to the informational events. So in this case, of course, we have noticed that both policy as well as private responses have mattered. So it's interesting, it's relevant to see that how much of the decline in social mobility has been due to private responses versus policy. And we can use our event study estimates to try and decompose that effect. So if y hat st is the fitted value of state S on date T from our event study regression, then the estimate of the counterfactual mobility in absence of policy is Y star ST, which is the difference between the fitted value from our model and the estimated coefficients effects of the post period. So doing that,
you should start wrapping up pretty soon.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
So we can do that for each state based on the timing of policy. And if we take an average of this across as a national average, looking at the effect for the mixing index, we find that between the first week of March and the second week of April, there was a significant decline of 142 points in the mixing index. 35% of that came from prior secular change, and about 65 of it can be attributed to policy changes. So the policy effects of reopening, again, just to recall, people started moving before the initial openings. Here the effects are much more noisy, but here also, while we don't find anything for the mixing index, and there are some pre-trends, though not statistically significant, we find a small increase in fraction at work as a result of state reopenings. Again, I'm not going to go into the details, but for across all the mobility measures, the effect of reopening has been smaller in magnitude, but we do find some statistically significant effects. And decomposing between the effect of policy versus secular changes, we find for the fraction at work, for instance, that in this case, about 70% of it has been due to secular change, and a smaller share of about 30% has been due to policy. So to conclude, both private response as well as policy induced social distancing has occurred during the closures as well as reopenings. And in the case of the closures, we found that informational events were more effective in inducing social distancing than hard mandates. And that's important for us to know, because for future epidemics, as well as potentially a second wave that we might be looking at, to know that which policies are most effective as NPI at lowest cost. So potentially targeted policies. So thank you.
Thank you, Samudha. That was very clear. The first discussant is Carolyn Bucky.
Hi, let me just share my screen. Okay. So thank you for inviting me. I'm the caveat here. I'm an infectious disease epidemiologist. I'm an associate professor at the Harvard Chan School, and I am not an economist. So I should just be very clear about that. I'm going to talk about the epidemiological aspects of this in relation to the non-pharmaceutical interventions, and just give some opinions or some views about how epidemiologists think about some of these kinds of issues to do with timing in relation to the epidemic, and what kinds of indicators we can use to look across states and look at heterogeneity in space. I'm just showing this graph because I think it illustrates nicely the nonlinearity inherent in epidemic processes and the geographic and temporal differences between different parts of this country. So of course we had early outbreaks in New York and New Jersey and other states on the coast. And then, as we've now seen, we're gradually moving into the other parts of the country, the South and the Southeast. And I think one important thing about that is that it means that people are reacting not only to messaging on a national level, but also to their local environment and the extent to which they perceive risk to be real to them and relevant. So I'm just going to talk about three things, really. The first thing is about this mobility data that has just been presented. I've worked with this kind of data for a long time, and I think it's not totally straightforward to interpret. Next, I'm going to talk about testing data. In one of the papers, testing data was used. I just want to talk about some of the epi aspects of that. And then third, just thinking about nonlinear dynamics and how we think about timing of policies. So just by way of introduction, I'm part of I started a network to analyze mobility data to support operationally policymakers around the country and internationally. And we've been working with multiple sources of data on quite local levels. And I've been doing this work for a long time now, using mobile operator data as well as data from apps and ad tech and so on. So I just want to point out a few things about this kind of information. So normally we think of this data in an ideal world, this kind of data would be like so. So you have a person and you're able to monitor their movements over time, and you have users, and together that gives you a picture of what's happening. So that is one kind of data that you can have access to. There are many privacy frameworks and different types of aggregation that has to happen in order for this to be safely shared. But fundamentally, we think that this is kind of the underlying kind of data that we're getting. For many data providers, however, especially providers like SafeGraph, when they talk about monthly active users, that is the total number of users altogether, but there's a ton of churn. So that's a very different thing than actually people appearing in your data set consistently throughout the month, or indeed daily users in a certain place. So although there may be many millions of people in the monthly active user axis, that actually doesn't mean that there's necessarily lots and lots of people in your data set. So there are some representativeness issues. We have started to look at comparing all these different data sets against each other. This just shows you a preliminary analysis looking at Google, Cubic, ad tech data, Facebook data, Mapbox, and so on, and trying to understand what these metrics mean. So a lot of data providers are putting out matrix like regular data about mixing indices and dwell times and stay at home, fraction of users staying at home, and these kinds of things. They're not all calculated in a standard way. The mathematical notation around how you do the aggregation can vary a lot. The representativeness varies a lot also. So there are some issues. This is from a paper that we were looking at county level variation in different characteristics that are relevant for COVID-19 in particular. And if you just look at this population over 70 years old axis, it's variable within states and variable across counties. And so if we imagine that smartphone users who are going to be represented in this data are generally younger, we are going to have both geographic biases and demographic biases that are important to think about. So the other thing is the metrics look different depending on what you're looking at. So this is just two examples from random counties, Suffolk County, New York, and one from Louisiana. And we're looking at movement in and out of a particular grid square compared to movement within, which might be more like the mixing index that we were looking at before. So the first thing is they look different, although maybe the trends are similar. These fits aren't very good, I'm afraid, but movement in and out, which is what we think of as kind of commuting patterns potentially, those are showing a stronger response. But again, depending on the county, we're seeing different fraction reduction. So there's this issue of trying to explain reductions of a certain percentage of reduction in mobility. It might mean something very different in New York compared to Louisiana for many reasons. And so interpreting percentage change in some of these metrics is challenging. And I think we need to be aware that there might be some systematic differences in different parts of the country and how we interpret those. So now I'm going to talk about testing. And this has been the bane of epidemiologists' life since the beginning of this outbreak. Confirmed cases is a very poor indicator of where we are with the epidemic. Sometimes it's all we have, but it's really problematic. So this is a paper from Mauricio Santillana looking at the correlation between new cases and new tests. And you can see the strong positive correlation. Essentially, this says the more testing you do, the more cases you find. So that means that what we're looking at when we see changes in the number of cases happening over time, we're seeing some combination of the true epidemic curve and whether we're able to test for it or not. So this just shows for these three states as well. We've got the new cases in red, the new tests in blue, and in some places we have sort of a problematic relationship between those two things, which makes it very difficult to use case counts. Especially as you've got this distinctive nonlinear dynamic associated with it. And so for an infectious disease epidemiologist, we don't use obviously linear regression or even quadratic regression when we analyze this highly nonlinear data, because the timescales are very short and things are changing quickly. If we use an SIR regression, so we fit it to a mechanistic model, then we can understand what's going on, we can make predictions, and we can interpret the coefficients of our model more effectively. And so this is some work that I've been doing in collaboration with Nick Menzies' group at Harvard. Because testing is so weak as an indicator of the epidemic, instead we use deaths. We fit death data, which we think is more reliable, although still not completely reliable. And then we use an SIR kind of framework to back calculate what the incident infections were that must have led to those deaths, because based on the premise that the test data itself is unreliable. So we have modeled outcomes of incidents. And if you use that as an indicator instead, then you can see that there's going to be variable number of kind of estimated cases despite what were being reported at the time. So just to point out that that's a difficult thing to keep track of. And in fact, in order to look at linearities, one thing that we can do is look at the reproduction number. So use the growth rate, which should be something that is going to change in a more step-like way in relation to these social distancing metrics. So if you measure the reproduction number over time, instead of trying to fit case counts, then you can get a growth rate, step changes in the growth rate, and you can compare that to your mobility patterns. So we have seen today that the stay-at-home orders were somewhat variable across states, but everybody actually seemed to stop moving in mid-March. And that's consistent with what we find in the epidemiology as well. So this paper is from Laurie Gardner's group, and they used data from Teralytics, which analyzes mobile operator data. And here you can see they've measured a sort of a social distancing ratio, which is a metric of mobility. Again, quite opaque to interpret this, but similar to what we've seen, right? This big drop, as Dr. Gupta was showing us before, mid-March, despite differences in the social distancing. And they measure this change in mobility in relation to the growth rate rather than cases, and then they're able to estimate how efficacious the lockdowns were. In fact, when we looked at this step change function in the reproduction number, and we compare the estimates of when the growth rate in the epidemic changed to when the mobility patterns changed, it converges among all county, each of these dots is a county, to that date. There was this step function change in the growth rate of the epidemic around the middle of March. So this really confirms and is consistent with the analyses that we've seen here, that the lockdown orders themselves, people's behaviors were changing before the lockdown orders themselves, irrespective of kind of what was happening locally. But of course, that depends on very different epidemics that were happening in different places. So in that mid-March region, new cases were taking off in New York, but there were barely any in Texas. And I think that probably played an important role in what happened subsequently, and the extent to which these mobility metrics are actually good indicators of what was happening with social distancing or not. The last thing I would say is just that we have a lot of micro heterogeneity in the epidemic itself and in the behavioral responses to social distancing orders. So this is a paper that we wrote where we looked at the seroprevalence. So how many pregnant women coming in to deliver, how many of them had antibodies, so had already had the virus in New York. And what you can see was that there's this heat map just shows the estimated prevalence. In some parts of New York, we had a quarter of the people have already had the infection, whereas in Manhattan, very few. And when we looked at commuting patterns, so this wasn't all mobility metrics, this was a very local look at commuting one way in the morning, the other way in the afternoon, you can see that it correlates perfectly. And here's the correlation between the decline in commuting movements and the relationship with seroprevalence. So that's to say that a lot of these metrics on a state level or even on a county level are obscuring important heterogeneities at a very local level. And we think that this this picture is driven, of course, by people that were not able to social distance and continued having to commute for work. So we can start to understand maybe something about what that means in terms of which jobs did people keep having to do, and which areas were able to social distance and stop working or not. But these are quite local differences. So the conclusions are, I think that there's great consistency between some of the two papers in terms of the messaging and the orders were, at least on the lockdown side, didn't seem to have a huge impact on changes in actual behavior and on the epidemic itself. The lockdowns were effective, but people locked down individually, just all at once, rather than because their state told them to. These non-linearities and the variable timing that are intrinsic to epidemic dynamics and the local heterogeneities are very important. And then both testing and mobility data have very important limitations. And I think sometimes to use them too precisely as quantitative measures is problematic. And then the last thing I would just say as an epidemiologist is, I think the discussion of the economics and labor markets is fascinating, especially as from an epidemiological point of view. We are very, very far from this epidemic being over, and we may well have to go back into lockdown again. Or if not in lockdown, makes major adaptation to the current policies. So it will be interesting to see how the public responds to further changes in that regard. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Carolyn. That was really helpful, and I'm sure we'll spark more discussion afterwards. The other discussant is Victor Chernozukov.
Okay, thank you for the interesting presentations and discussions. I just want to say that I find all of these studies very interesting and very innovative. Lots of interesting new facts, like also using modern data, private data. Can you see my screen fully? Yeah. And what I will do, in my discussion, I will mostly focus on the effect of NPIs on behavioral and economic outcomes, and also I'll highlight the connections to some complementary findings that we've reported in this paper, which is called Causal Impact of Masks, Policies, Behavior on Early COVID-19 Pandemic, where we did the sort of exercise that Caroline described. You look at the growth rates in deaths and cases, you control for the testing rate for cases, and you study the effects of policies, behavior, and masks. So like we as part of the analysis, we did touch upon the effect of policies on behavior, because this is one of the channels through which policies realize themselves. And maybe I'll raise a minor methodological point about the fixed effect estimators at the end, if I have time. So I enjoyed reading the first paper. They really did document well the collapse of the labor market, the small business labor market. It was extreme and sudden. Everything happened in the last 2 weeks of March. Turning to the effect of NPIs, the paper focuses only on the shelter-in-place policies and finds the effects are small. When I was reading this paper, it gave me the impression that other NPIs played relatively small role. And I want to highlight in my discussion that, well, it's only one of the policies, and there were many other policies adopted exactly in this last 2 weeks of March, and I'm going to highlight that their role, hopefully. The second paper also focuses on shelter, stay-at-home policies and emergency declaration as purely information policies, and establishes the association between this mobility and these policies. They find that during the shutdown phase, the large decline in mobility happened whether or not the stay-at-home policies were mandated. And then therefore they proceed to suggest that a substantial share of the observed decline is a private response to the new information. In particular, the case announcements, emergency declarations reduced mobility by large amounts, essentially all of the observed decline. Again, I want to kind of raise here a gentle objection. Well, shelter is only one of the many policies. Also, the informational effect of the emergency declaration alone is unclear to me. Personally, I actually didn't pay any attention to such declarations until the schools and restaurants and the gym got closed. And to me, the causal channel of school closures is super clear. There are hard policies restricting mobility, like parents have to stay at home if schools are closed. They probably don't go, like with smaller children, you don't go out as often. You just order food out and things like that, right? So then I'll just look at this some of these data cuts that we have also looked at. So here's the Google mobility behavior shows big drops in time in work, retail, transit in late March, followed by another decrease in April. Like this is workplace intensity, retail intensity, transportation intensity. And the question, of course, how does this relate to policies? Well, there's a state of emergency, which is a pure declaration, but it's a pure declaration that allows governor to issue a package of executive orders, like the hard policies, such as school closures, non-essential business closures, restrictions on restaurants, like movie theater closures, gym closures, and so on, right? So by mid-March, these emergencies were declared, and they were like right away. They were followed by school closures, followed by more slower rollout of the other policies. So here's the plot for the rollout of policies. Like, yeah, you see the school, like almost all school got everything got closed within 2 weeks of March. But the other policies were more they were rolled out more gradually, maybe except for the restaurant closures. So like what's okay, so that's one point. When I look at the correlation, and these are like week level, like we always work with MA7 data, like MA smooth data. So this is, you could think of this as weekly correlations. The emergency policies that are purely declarative are super highly correlated with hard policies such as school closures, and less so with restaurant closures and movie closures. So for example, the correlation between the state of emergency and school closures is 95%. So personally, like I wouldn't if I have to assign some efficiency to the policies, like I would be more careful. I wouldn't want to say that the effect was purely informational, just looking at this correlation alone. Second point that I want to make is that the school closures had very little cross-sectional variation. So what it means is that we have we're going to have an identification or attribution problem. It's going to be hard to tell apart the school effects, closure effects from the general information or private response effect. So the policy evaluation results are going to be very sensitive as to how we model the time effects. So perfectly flexible time effect models, like the fixed effect time effect models that are being used, will mostly observe the school closure effects due to lack of cross-sectional variation. As a result, we may end up incorrectly allocating, attributing time effects to private response to the information, where in reality, I think there's little identification. In fact, the opposite could be true. So here's just to illustrate this point, here's an exercise that we did where we predict this Google mobility time at work, retail, and transport 2 weeks out using various policies in place. So, and then we have two sets of specification. One is with rich specification for the time effects, and one with the less stringent specification for the time effects. You do find like each of the policies matter, but the school closure effects are like really large if you don't control for time effects flexibly. If you control for the time effects flexibly, the school effects are much smaller. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Like if you don't do flexible time effects, like the policy maybe explains like more than half the observed decline of the effect. The more than half of the observed decline, and with flexible time effects, it maybe explains roughly half of the observed decline. That's what this table shows. Another point that I want to make, it's more probably it's more minor. So here we're using this fixed effect estimators. You have this latent. You have the dependent variable, which is typically a growth rate. Then you have time varying policies. You have latent effects, FIs, which are also called fixed effects, and they're correlated with the XITs. You could also have time effects as part of the XITs. And the assumption, the standard condition for unbiasedness of the fixed effect estimators of beta is that these innovations here have to be orthogonal to the leads and lags of XIT. So they have to be orthogonal to the leads and lags of the policies, and then the informational variables, which I think it's just probably not, maybe true, maybe, but certainly not true for some of the specifications that are present in many of the COVID papers. If T is short, and I can argue that T is short, then there's going to be substantial bias in the fixed effect estimator. This bias is still this estimator is still consistent, but it will have a bias. This bias needs to be removed. An alternative approach would be something called correlated random effects approach or mixed effects approach, where you just model FIs as using time invariant covariates and so on. And this is actually what we did in our paper. We went with correlated random effects approach. However, I want to say that one could do the fixed effect approach estimation with debiasing. And in our tries of debiasing the fixed effect estimators, for example, we noticed that it materially impacts the estimates. So for example, shelter stay at home effects, they were materially larger after doing bias correction. And I also want to make this point here that the T here is short. So the debiasing is going to matter when the time series dimension is short. And what is T here? Well, T is, roughly speaking, is the number of approximately independent blocks of data. And so T is probably counts it's probably proportional to the number of weeks and not to the, is probably closely related to the number of weeks rather than number of days. And therefore I could say, yeah, it's short. And if T was large, that this debiasing wouldn't actually matter. And if one is interested more in this, we have an expository paper on this where we reanalyzed the causal impact of democracy on growth, and we also found that after bias correction, the effects of policies was much larger than without bias correction. And then we have Stata and our code available if anybody wants to use it. That's it on my end here.
Okay, thank you, Victor. You can unshare your slides and we'll open up for discussion. I'm going to go to the attendees. We have a few hands up already. I'll start with Jason Furman.
Okay, great. My question is for Jesse. And I wanted to know if, we're still seeing 2 million UI claims a week, including pandemic. So a lot of people are still losing their jobs. Do we know anything about the different characteristics of the types of people or the types of jobs that are being lost now compared to 2 or 3 months ago? How many of them might be sort of secondary, more normal recession-like, as opposed to primary, directly impacted? And what might any of that mean for the trajectory of employment going forward?
My co-authors can jump in as well. That's a good question. I think we're seeing some evidence. I'm drawing not on our paper, but on Sylvan Doctor's work with California unemployment insurance claims, that the people who are filing claims now are less heavily selected than the people who were filing claims at the beginning. At the beginning, it was very heavily less educated workers from particular industries, and they're looking more representative now, which I think is consistent with the idea that we were shutting down these couple sectors, and now we've got something that's becoming closer to a real recession. But it's still pretty fragmentary and pretty indirect.
I'll share a quick graph from our paper that I think speaks a little bit to this. So this shows from the CES. This is the payroll employment by month by industry, and you do see kind of like the pattern that we had, like leisure and hospitality and other services decline, especially at the start. At least through May, you're not seeing necessarily an acceleration of kind of like durable goods, manufacturing job losses or construction job losses. If anything, like the construction sector seems to have rebounded more than some other sectors. And so they might look different in June, but at least some of the kind of aggregate data through May is not seeing quite as much of those of kind of more typical recession drops as I might have expected actually prior to May.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. The next question will be from Hillary Hoynes.
Hi, thanks so much. This is a little bit speculative, but I wonder if you could indulge me in speculating. And that is, it seems like one piece of the labor market, the stuff you show is super clear and extremely spot on for, as you point out, the home-based coverage is very appropriate for measuring what's happening in real time, which is great. But I wonder whether, could there ever be a day that we could match up who gets the PPP with your home-based data? Because it seems like one really big thing that I'm not understanding is the extent to which that actually led to changes in the connectivity of workers to firms, who got it, did it end up where we would have hoped, and many other aspects and understanding role of that in the evolution of the labor market. So I wonder if you guys could speak to that at all.
So I can handle that, Jesse. So we can't, I think right now we haven't done that yet, but we've been collaborating with a team of other folks at Harvard, Zoe Cullen and Glazer, Michael Luca and Chris Stanton, to do a firm survey of the home-based firms. And we've gotten, which we've closed recently, that includes questions about whether or not you've applied, whether or not you've received PPP. And so I think with that other team of folks, I think we're going to see if we can use that to try to kind of directly look at the effects of PPP receipt in a more direct way, in a more kind of quasi-experimental setup than the analysis without that firm survey that we did here.
So was there ever going to be a public listing of those firms?
Oh,
so Hillary, I'll just add one thing there. So I think up until last week, there was, kind of only the data at the state level was going to be available, and some breakdown by firm size and by loan size. And it seems like the Treasury has just decided they're going to make more data, kind of more data public that would identify the name of the companies that received the money, at least for the bigger loans, if I remember. So I think it is not all the question, that we require getting some kind of agreement with Homebase that, this administrative data, if it does indeed become available, could be linked to the tens of thousands of employees we have in Homebase. It's not all of the question.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take the next question from Steve Goss.
Jan, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, a quick question, probably largely for Caroline. There's been a lot of talk about seasonality, and people have looked at Brazil, for example, but of course, Brazil's in the Southern Hemisphere. So opposite seasons to us, and they've had a surge. Now, where the EU has had great results over the last several months coming down, the US not so much. is part of the EU's success related to seasonality, and they may not be as lucky come the fall? And if they won't be, then how will we be doing in the US come the fall?
So the other circulating coronaviruses are quite seasonal, and we see a strong effect in the summer. There's likely to be some seasonal effect for this one, but probably not huge from what we can tell so far. With, again, the main risk factors being, crowding indoors and so on. So I think the relative success or lack of success in the US compared to the EU is largely a policy failure, testing failure, messaging and social response issue. I don't think it's to do with seasonality. Having said that, in some of the southern states in the summer, it's very hot outside and we will have people indoors, and that seems to be very problematic, and why we may not have had upticks in cases from the protests, for example, because they were outside. So I think it remains to be seen. My best guess is that there is some seasonality, but that's not the dominant driver. Are we worried about the fall in the US? Absolutely. And that is to do with school openings and potentially colleges going back, and as well as this winter month issue that will bring other seasonal viruses on top of this one, as well as the flu season and so on. So if that explains it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that. There was a question that came up in the Q&A that you answered, Carolyn, but other people might be interested in knowing. Henry Aaron asked about treatments and whether improved treatments were factored into any of the modeling or whether that was showing up in the data. So we've talked a lot about spread and death, but we haven't talked about treatments. Could you pick up that thread?
Sure. The question was about whether the trends in deaths can be related to changing in treatments. Maybe partially, but there haven't been any big breakthroughs on treatments. There was a recent trial of dexamethasone that shows partial reduction in mortality in people that require supplemental oxygen. And of course, there are many other trials ongoing. Those haven't been rolled out widely yet. So I don't think that they're having a massive impact on treatment and the death rate. What I think it has happened is that at the beginning of the outbreak in this country, we had a huge fraction of deaths occurred in nursing homes and assisted care facilities. And subsequently, as we've had this reopening, we're seeing many more cases in young people. So of course, they have a lower mortality rate anyway. So it's quite hard to disentangle whether that's a demographic shift reflecting transmission, but also probably social distancing behavior where older people might still be distancing, whereas younger people are less so. And we're just seeing a shift in age group as well. It's hard to disentangle exactly what's happening, but that I suspect is going to be one important factor.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's go back to the authors for their responses. Let's start with the first paper. Jesse, Marianne, I don't know who you want to have give some responses to the discussants and to the Q&A.
I can go. So I'll handle a couple of the first ones, and I think there was one you were going to handle, Jesse. But I think the first one of the first big comments that I think came up in both Victor's discussion and Caroline's discussion, what I think is totally spot on, is that we had kind of in this first analysis focused on the shutdown orders. I think for a variety of reasons. One, just because that was what we were most confident we were measuring correctly, and then because it was kind of been like some of the most discussed policies. But we totally take as a spot on comment that we should kind of incorporate the fuller set of policies into our analysis, and it's something that we can definitely do in the next draft. I mean, particularly given the daily data of the daily nature of the home-based data does give us some capacity to kind of look at relatively fine measures of timing. Just one kind of clarification I would like to make sure that we said is that we're not, at least in our analysis, taking a strong stance that the time effects are information per se. Like our interpretation of those was that they reflected kind of reduced consumer demand for in-person services, which could in part be a function of schools being closed. That changes how parents consume in-person services, which I think a lot of anecdotal evidence that that's true. But I think totally it's spot on that we should kind of look at this kind of richer set of policies, and I think that's definitely going to be one of the things that's on the top of our to-do list going forward.
I can take on just the question about the nickel bias issue. We've estimated a bunch of different models trying to do this. We presented the basic fixed effects models in the paper, but we've also done synthetic control style models that match on pre-treatment outcomes, and you get very similar results. I think in theory, there's an issue. I'd be surprised if it's a big issue in practice in these models. And these panels aren't all that short when we're looking at daily data. We've got 30 days before the treatments happen in some cases, I think, in the models. So I'm not as worried about it, but obviously it could be an issue.
Yeah, and one thing that we haven't done yet, but it actually is possible given the nature of the home-based sample, is we have home-based data for 2018 and 2019. And just for simplicity, we haven't done a ton with that previous period data, but we can kind of, to some extent, extend CAP-T going back, which should also help.
I think there's some concern that I don't know that state fixed effects are stable over time, and maybe that the specification gets wrong if we start to put in 2 years of data in there. But
okay, thanks. Any comments, responses from the second paper? Sumedha, Kosali, Cody?
Yeah, I will start by thanking the discussants for their comments. Starting with Caroline, I think I couldn't agree with you more. I agreed with like every slide you put. I'm like, yes, that makes perfect sense. Lots of heterogeneity, completely. I noted that as well. We've noted that in the manuscript as well. And I think that is what you said, that we do need to look at all these measures. They're saying different things. They are very opaque. We don't exactly know all we should know and want to know. And hopefully as we move forward, because these are so new, at least to econ research, unlike the experience you have for a while, that we are hoping to discover more about how exactly they're capturing these things. So right now our approach has been, let's look at all of them. Let's look at all of them and see if they give us a consistent story. And if they do, we feel a little bit more comfortable saying, okay, maybe not the exact magnitude number, but it seems that generally this is the direction of the effect. So that's for Caroline. We did do some of the analysis looking at some local, I did not have the time to present them, but we looked at some like rural versus urban differences and things, and they are in the manuscript. And yes, they're important. We find very different effects in those. So points well taken. With Victor, I'm very curious to find out more about your bias correction, and we'll definitely look at the papers to see if we can implement it. Regarding the emergency declarations versus stay at home, I think the point is true that if you look at the entire timing of this, all of this happened within 3 weeks, the whole bunch of the initial policies, and maybe the stay at home orders stand a little bit further down the line. And so it is really hard to disentangle the effects of each and every one of them. And I think the way we discussed it in the manuscript, and I should mention here as well, is that we think of the emergency declaration sort of like a reduced form effect for the bunch of these policies. It almost is like it triggered the start of what can be considered as a whole bunch of these policies. But yes, it's hard to we did do some estimations by including controls for all of them, by having linearized event time studies to see the effects for all of them simultaneously. But I agree that it's hard to distinguish. And I think we only want to say that there has been a private response, which is very large. There is obviously some policy response, whichever that policy you want to think about and you feel you're confident you can disentangle in that short period of time. But yeah, point well taken. Thank you.
Others? All right, terrific. Thanks to both sets of authors and both discussants.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.